Welcome to Decision Point. I'm your host today, James Hahn, and joining us today we have Kurt Potter from the Center for Self-Governance joining us in the studio. Kurt, welcome to El Paso.
Well, thank you very much.
Ever been here before?
Just once or twice.
Okay.
Yeah,
How do you like it?
Oh no, it's beautiful. It's gorgeous desert, and the weather's a lot warmer here than it is back home.
What brings you into town this time?
We're teaching a class with the Center for Self-Governance. It's our level 1 class where we kind of reframe the way people think about government and how they interact with it.
Okay, I was doing some research about this organization. I guess you have 5 tiers. It's an institute. You're based out of Tennessee. Anywhere else, any other chapters in any other states perhaps?
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. The organization itself was created, 3 or 4 years ago. The idea was to take other citizens inside of Tennessee and turn them into our teammates working along with us at the Tennessee State Legislature. As we grew, one of the things that happened was we tried to figure out how we're going to bring these people up to the same level of knowledge we had. And as we were doing that, we started teaching citizens in Tennessee. The first year, 2012, we taught roughly 70 students, and several of them had found out what we were teaching in Tennessee and had come from other states into Tennessee to come learn what we were teaching.
It's probably a good thing because the legislators make complicated phrases and not everyday language that most of us generally don't understand, so it's good to have an organization such as yours. Primarily, what's the makeup of your organization? Is it like politically active college students? Are there politicians involved? Who is this course designed for?
Actually, the course is designed for citizens, but we've had legislators, we've had college students, we've had people who are lobbyists, we've had people who are lawyers who've come taking the courses. Our course is really about teaching citizens how to wield their power inside the legislative function and how to have influence in government.
I would dare call it an advanced civics course from what the research I was doing. Looks
Sure.
very intense.
Well, what's really interesting is it's again the class is really about how to wield power. And so from that standpoint, we've had lawyers and people who were poli-sci majors who have come through the process who've said, wow, they never taught us this in school.
I've got a lot of great quotes that I've picked up from your website, from YouTube. What is your website, by the way? It's tncsg.org, correct?
Yep, and we've just launched a new website, and it's called centerforselfgovernance.com.
Okay, okay.
And so our old website, we had built it, for having use inside of the state of Tennessee, and now all of a sudden, now that we're in 18 states and have over 3,000 students this year,
wow,
it's just not adequate. So we're bumping up our abilities through our website.
One of these great quotes that I saw on there, and it kind of comes back to how politics and the system seem to have gotten out of control and gotten out of our grasp, is who's in control of whom.
Well, that's a great point. It's interesting. I think James Madison, Federalist 51, said, I'm going to paraphrase here, but he said, if men were angels, there'd be no need for government. And we are really in a paradox in our society. We live in a social contract. We live within a shared system of laws amongst each other. And so we have to find a way to allow government to have some power and control to be able to control the masses, right? But at the same time, we have to control instituted government so that it doesn't infringe on our rights.
Well, that's how it was designed in the first place, correct?
Absolutely.
Some other stuff that I found very interesting. Let's see here. Great quote from Benjamin Franklin to Elizabeth Powell. This is something that you guys use a lot in your campaign. After the Constitutional Convention, Mrs. Powell asked Mr. Franklin, "What have you given us? A monarchy or a republic? I'm sorry." And Ben Franklin's response was, "It's a republic if you can keep it." Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Sure. And one of the funny things about it is that is often misquoted. He didn't say a republic if you can keep it. He looked at her and he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." He personalizes this to her. And this is why this becomes so important, because we live in a country where government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. And because it derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, that means that in that relationship we have a certain authority. And so what we have to do is relearn how to exercise our civic authority again. And so when you start to look at the Mrs. Powell story, this is really, really important, because here's Eliza Powell, Elizabeth Willing Powell, in 1787, can't vote, certainly can't hold elected office. So how is she supposed to keep the republic? You know, there are a lot of people who say, well, she could influence her husband and he could vote, and that's the old if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy argument, right?
Yeah, seeing as how the Suffrage Act hadn't passed yet, a long time, yeah.
Absolutely, but the interesting piece is that her and her husband owned a boarding house. And to attract wealthy customers, she would hold these elaborate dinners every night, and they would attract people like Benjamin Rush and George Washington to stay at their home. And so what was interesting is when the men after dinner would retire to the parlor to smoke their pipes and talk politics, in a time when it was unpopular for women to do so, she would go into the parlor and talk politics with the men. And so it's been recorded in history how she had, I'm trying to remember how it said it, she had a keen intellect and a wicked wit. And so what it came down to was she was funny and she was smart, and they would listen to her. And it came to a point where now all of a sudden when you have George Washington, when they're trying to figure out whether they're going to have a king or a president, she takes a shot across George Washington's bow. She says to him, she sends him a note, says something to the effect of, George, you want to be the king. I can see it in your eye. Yeah. So think about this. This is a woman who's been able to build influence with George Washington. Excuse me. And so what ends up happening is she even helped direct our history. George Washington, at the end of his first term, didn't want to become president again. He was tired. He'd had it up to here with politics. And so from that standpoint, he had his own things going on back in Mount Vernon. He wanted to go home. And so he had the speech written where he wasn't going to run for a second term. And the night before he's supposed to deliver that speech, he gets a letter up to his room. And the letter says, and I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect that the Anti-Federalists will seize upon this moment to suggest that our form of government is illegitimate, and they will say that you are trying to gracefully extract yourself. So the next morning he gets up, goes over to Liberty Hall, scraps his speech, delivers another one off the cuff, running for a second term of office.
They lit a fire under him, didn't they?
Absolutely. And the point is here's a woman, 1787, can't vote, can't hold elected office, but she certainly had power.
That's absolutely amazing, and this is educational for me because I've never heard of her in the history books. I didn't find out about her till I was doing research on your organization. So that's very interesting. Good for her. I think some of the ladies out here influence your daughters to study more about Elizabeth Powell. Kind of back along those lines of how to get the citizens more involved. I was reading here from your website. The Center for Self-Governance teaches how to inform the discretion of their fellow citizens. What does that mean? Well, discretion is your decision making. And so really it comes from a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson once said, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of our society but in the people themselves. And if you find them not capable of exercising their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them but to inform their discretion by education." So this is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power, is what he said. That makes perfect sense. Things have gotten so out of hand, it's just ridiculous. Absolutely, but it's amazing because when you start to look at where power resides in our society, it's in individuals. It's in individual citizens. Right. And so it's, from that standpoint, it's not just your vote, but it's your ability to control instituted government that becomes your power. And so what's happening is we have a lot of people in our society who are ignoring what's going on around them, and so therefore they don't have the information that it takes to make a well-informed decision. So what we do is we teach citizens how to go into the legislative process, how to effectively engage their legislators, how to build the information of what's happening behind the scenes, and then deliver that back to the citizens. I like that. That's the next part of what you guys do. It's how to instruct delegated authority, citizens having the right to instruct their representatives. No more letter writing nowadays. Go park on their doorstep and really make a voice, right? Well, you know, it's interesting because we've seen a lot of people rally. And that was one of the things that really struck me back in 2009 when they had that big rally. 1 million people showed up in Washington, D.C. And what I realized while I was there was that you had all these folks with signs. One guy I saw it said TEA, taxed enough already. Another, no Obamacare, and there were all these things. And one of the things I realized was these guys went straight to tactics. They had no strategy to accomplish their goal. And so really what we have to understand is that rallying is a tactic, and as long as it supports a broader strategy, that's great. But if you're not using it to support that strategy,
then you're really, I mean, it becomes very, very difficult to really influence government that way.
True, and the good thing about your institute is the fact that I've got some more quotes here. You educate and mobilize citizens to reclaim their role at the center of government. You teach them how to effectively engage legislators instead of just the crazy guy going off, you know, we don't want polar bears destroyed anymore, or whatever random topic they want to pick. You give them an educated way of approaching these people and allow them to use the language that's appropriate to them and able to speak to them on their level in an educated fashion so that they're received better. One of the things that they teach us in broadcasting, know your audience. You've got to know who you're talking to and how to speak to them in order to, I don't always do it so well sometimes myself, but but you've got to be able to get your point across effectively. So I like that. You also, it's a training institute to train citizens to teach them how to exercise their civic authority. Now, can you explain the difference between civic responsibility and civic authority?
Yes. Civic responsibility is you acting in a governmental capacity. So, for example, when you vote, that's exercising your civic responsibility.
Okay.
If you were to sit on a jury, that's exercising your civic responsibility. Exercising your civic authority is actually you going in and instructing your legislators. And there's an entire process for that. It's not just simply you walking in, sticking a finger in their face and saying, you better do what I want you to do, which, you know, quite frankly is the level of engagement that I see a lot of citizens engaging in. And what they don't realize is that when they do that, you know, their legislators are people just like they are. If somebody were to come stick a finger in your face, what are you going to do, right?
Right.
You know, the wall's going to go up, you lose your credibility. And from that standpoint, they've done something absolutely antithetical to them wielding any power in that relationship.
So you're really trying to build common ground between the citizen and the representative, the
Well,
elected official.
to a certain degree. I mean, this is what we're trying to do is get them to build professional relationships with their legislators, but professional relationships that allow them to hold them accountable. You know, it's interesting because what we're really teaching in a way is politics. And when you look at politics, the definition of politics is it's social relations involving intrigue to gain power and authority. You know, so when you start to realize that, what is it the Bible says about being as wise as serpents but gentle as doves? That's really what it comes down to. You know, one of the things that we teach the citizens that we teach is that when you start to deal with legislation, what is government at its end? Government is force. And so when we create legislation, what we're saying is that this idea that I have for society is so important that I'm willing to stick a gun in my neighbor's face to force them to live this way. So what that does is that makes us have to have a different view on legislation as we push it. And so now all of a sudden we have to start thinking critically about this whole process. And so what we want to do is we want to help citizens build those relationships with their legislators that allow them to be as wise as serpents and to be able to build, and again, the definition is social relations involving intrigue. Intrigue is an involved in crafty plot, right? And so what we want to do is have them be wise as serpents as they are engaging in those social relations so that they can wield their civic authority.
Know how to play by the rules when you're in somebody else's game.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I think really what it comes down to is understanding those relationships and how they're set up and why we engage in them.
Excellent. You know, here in El Paso over the last several years, we've suffered through a lot of political scandals. There's been corruption, and we're talking school boards, we're talking city politics, county commissioners, et cetera. I know this probably pertains to most of the country, but it's left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, and people have become apathetic. They're just not willing to participate anymore. You hear some people that are on the extreme that say, well, we're going to make a difference come November. We're going to go to the ballot box. We're going to make a difference. But voter turnout in our area is really, really low. What would you tell people listening and watching right now? How would you get the point across to them that we actually can make a difference and we can make a change, even though it seems like it's so corrupted and it seems like we're just kind of speaking into the wind without any results?
You know, it's interesting because people believe, and I see this all the time, where they'll walk into their county commission and they'll say, I know the county commission's going to do this. And they say, you know, if only I can make a cogent argument, surely they'll see the logic of what I'm trying to tell them, and they'll not do whatever it is I think they're going to do.
I think we've all had that thought at some point.
Absolutely. And then they walk in, they make their impassioned plea, and then the county commission goes and does whatever they were going to do in the first place. Well, the problem is that there is an entire process before that meeting. That meeting that they go to, that's the meeting where they've already made their decision and they're just going to vote on it. There's an entire process before that called the lobby process where they actually are informed on these issues and they're developing their decisions. And so from that standpoint, where are we in that process? You know, they're hearing from other legislators, they're hearing from lobbyists, special interest groups, all these other folks who are informing their discretion, right? But where are the citizens?
Right.
And so what's amazing is, you know, and from a broader standpoint, looking at the election cycle, you know, elections aren't won in the election cycle. They're won in the previous legislative cycle.
True.
That's where you find the information that's going to allow you to win that election.
True, true, very true.
So what we try to do is we try to train citizens in all those pieces of the puzzle so that they know how to actually put it together rather than thinking that what they just need to do is go to government and make their rant.
That's a really good point. I know that, you know, we've got a gubernatorial election coming up, gubernatorial, excuse me. So many hot topics. It seems like, and this is probably another reason why people become discouraged with the process. It seems like often we have to vote between the lesser of two evils. We never have an ideal candidate. I know abortion's a big deal right now, but you don't really hear the candidates talking about abortion. I would think that your institute would bring some people, some fresh ideas and some fresh minds, some new blood into the political arena, and may even inspire some of the folks that attend your seminars and your conferences to actually become representatives, elected officials themselves, and really be able to make a change. Have you seen anything like that along your lines so far?
We have. I've had some of my students who have gone on to become elected officials.
Excellent.
You know, it's funny. I always tell people that I'll never run for office, and the reason I'll never run for office is because I don't want to give up the power. And that's the amazing thing, is that, you know, we often think of our elected officials as being more powerful, but the fact is when they actually enter into government, they lose power. And so when you start to understand that power dynamic and how it actually works, as opposed to the way we've been brought up to view what we like to call the conventional wisdom, it's amazing how you can actually start seeing the citizens wielding power and actually controlling instituted government.
Has the CSG, that's the Center for Self-Governance, seen any results, any major bills, or any example that you can give us that you guys have actually made a difference at this point?
Sure, and it's not us that are making the difference, it's the citizens on the ground.
True.
You know, really all we are is we're a training institution. We teach people how the process works, and then they go out and they implement it. And when they do, they're having tremendous success. We've got some students out in Colorado who have actually started a recall on like 3 state representatives, and actually had one step down so she wouldn't be recalled. Also, are you familiar with Dave Bratt?
No, it doesn't sound familiar.
Okay, the Dave Bratt campaign, he's the guy who ran against Eric Cantor. Had about $300,000 versus Eric Cantor's, I want to say he had like $8 million in the. And so anyway, he defeated Eric Cantor in his district in Virginia. And so now Eric Cantor will be leaving, well, I guess he's actually resigned now, he's left office. And so from that standpoint, the citizens on the ground who built that ground game, we train those folks.
Excellent. Another quote from one of your co-founders, David,
which?
Can't think of his name right now.
A co-founder.
One of the co-founders. He was on.
Mark Herr?
No, it wasn't Mark Herr. It was another gentleman. David Barton?
Oh, he was on David Barton's show.
David Barton, yes, okay. He had something that I really liked. He was quoting, it was Proverbs 23:7, as a man thinks in his heart, he is. And you guys kind of parlayed that into mind manacles. Now, can you elaborate on that? Because I thought that was a very interesting concept, and it kind of relays back to how we just feel so out of the political process and like we really can't make a change.
Sure. The Mind Forged Manacles idea really came from a poem. T.S. Eliot wrote a poem called The Love Song of Jalfred Prufrock. And in that poem, he talks about what we call our mind forged, or what he calls our mind forged manacles. And what manacles are is they're those old-timey handcuffs with the pins in them. Right. And basically what he was saying is we handcuff ourselves by what we believe we can or cannot do. I think Henry Ford said it best. He said, whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. And so once we start believing that we can, and once we start learning how to engage and start engaging, it's amazing the power and authority that citizens have in this country.
Kind of reminds me, when the Occupy movement was going on, people got really excited like they could make a change, and like everything else, Obama promised change, and just nothing really has changed, at least not for the better anyways. Something else that I found interesting that while doing research on your organization, I guess there's 5 principles of government that the Constitution was founded on. And it's, we believe there's a creator, that being the government. We believe the creator gives certain guaranteed rights that the government can't touch. We believe there's certain fixed morals that no one can alter. We believe that the government exists to protect our inalienable rights. We believe that below inalienable rights and moral law, we, being the government, run it by the consent of the governed. And we believe that the government didn't do those first 5 things. We can change the government. Now, one thing that I'm curious about, that I know that I've discussed in different Bible studies and church groups that I've attended, is why do you think, and this is going to be a hypothetical question, but why do you think the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson primarily, I suppose, why were they not more specific about including God specifically when they wrote those 5 principles and wrote the Constitution?
Well, they included God in the Declaration of Independence, and I think what they didn't do is they didn't include Christ's name. But I think when you start to look at the founding of our country, there were a lot of people here. Ultimately, you had a lot of different faiths. I mean, there were Jews in the country at the time. So from that standpoint, I think that they believed in a Judeo-Christian ethic, but at the same time, I think that they were trying to be very, very inclusive of all the citizens that were here.
They were already demonstrating political correctness.
Yeah, to a certain degree.
That's very interesting.
But and from that standpoint, though, I think a lot of other philosophers were involved there too. I think when you start to look at John Locke, hugely influential. Thomas Jefferson said that Locke, Bacon, and Newton were 3 of his biggest influences. So when you start to see all of that kind of pulled together, I think that our founding fathers were very, very faithful men, and I think that was in a time when they needed that as well. I think God really moved His hand in what this country is. One of the things that I always like to point out in one of my classes is that when you start to look at the Jews leaving Egypt, God had them wandering in the desert for 40 years before they could enter the Promised Land. Why is that? I mean, ultimately, they had a slave mentality. And so now all of a sudden, they start sending scouts into Israel, or into the Promised Land, and the scouts are saying, oh, we can't win, we can't, the foes are too big. And they wandered in the desert talking about how easy it would be just to go back to Pharaoh. And so now all of a sudden, 40 years later, they've bred out that slave mentality, and you have people who are truly independent going into the Promised Land. And so I think that really played a big part in our country. I mean, when you start to look at the Mayflower landing in 1620, and then 1776 when we write the Declaration of Independence, that's 156 years. What is that, 5, maybe 6 generations in the time? So you've had people who'd come over from England. They still 5 generations later knew that they had a connection to England, but they weren't living under the thumb of the crown. And so from that standpoint, they were very, very independent. They had bred out that slave mentality. And now all of a sudden you've got the crown starting to impose things on them, and they're like, who is this crown to impose this on us? And I think that was very important in the way that our country was founded. And I think it's that independence that, even though I think in a big way we seem to be slipping back to the slave mentality to a certain degree, I think that independence has been bred in our country and in our society, in the way our government's formed and founded, and the way that we engage government. And I think that's all very important in the way we deal with this. And
that probably goes back to, over the last several decades, we seem to have lost hope that there would be any true change.
Sure. And you have a lot of folks who are saying, well, it's easier just to go to government. Let government make the decisions. And from that standpoint, I look at the church and I say, is this society going to change from government? No, it's the church that's going to create the societal change that happens in our country. And so I think to myself, imagine what it would be like if the church understood its civic authority, understood how to engage government and be able to wield authority in that relationship. Imagine if the people who are sitting in the pews on Sunday had understood their civic authority and how to engage government. This could be a very, very different country.
It really could. That's a very good point. You know, I know there's a thing going on in Houston, the 5 priests or preachers that have been, their sermons have been subpoenaed. I think it's happening somewhere else. I know here a couple of years ago we had one of our priests here in town, our preacher, sorry. We have a lot of Catholics here. He was upset with something that the city did about equal rights for basically homosexual couples and paying out pensions and health care insurance and what have you. And the city passed it anyways. He stood up and he went ahead and filed against the city. They got a little upset because in his pulpit he went ahead and tried to demonstrate his civic authority within the congregation and motivate them to go out and make a noise. And so I think that was a really good example. Something that I'm curious about that I saw here on your website here, and we have just a couple of minutes left, but can you explain the difference between power and government? I think this is something that people really need to be able to understand the distinction between.
Sure, and I think to make that distinction, I think there's a couple of things that we need to understand. Number one, the definition of rights. Rights, you know, most people know that they have rights. They can kind of feel what they are, but they can't define them. You know, what would you say a right is? You know, and you know, most people say, well, it's something that's given to you by God. I hear a lot of times people say it's something that can't be taken away. You know, but they can't define what a right is. But a right, by definition, is a just claim to something. That's all it is. And so, you know, from that standpoint, you know, I wonder. Sometimes I ask the students, you know, you say that a right can't be taken away. Can it not? You may have a just claim to something, but the question becomes, do you have the power to reach out and take your claim? And so power, by definition, is strength or force producing an effect. And so the question is, yeah, do you have the power to reach out and take your claim? And does somebody else have the power to reach out and take it from you? You know, you have a right to your life, but somebody may very well have the power to take that. And so that becomes this issue of power. What are we trying to do? We're trying to teach people how to exercise power inside of a governance structure. And so governance is just merely a method or system of management, and government in itself is the entity that is there to exercise that management of our social contract, our shared system of laws.
Thank you, Kurt Potter, for joining us today. For any other contact information, you're going to be having seminars throughout the next several months, I believe, here in El Paso at the Better Business Bureau. We're looking at contact information, Lorraine Huffman at 915-269-7719. That's 269-7719. And you can find out more information about the different conferences that are coming up. And it's all for the Center for Self-Governance, correct?
Yes, sir. And you can see our website at centerforselfgovernance.com.
Excellent. Thank you again, Kurt Potter. We appreciate you coming here.
You bet. Thank you.
God bless you. I'm Jamie Hahn, and we'd like to thank you for joining us today on Decision Point. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can visit us on Facebook, and we'll see you. God bless you.